The air in the boardroom was thick and still, like breathing dust. It smelled of stale coffee and something else, something like old success gone sour. My husband stood at the head of the long, polished table, his usual swagger amplified, puffing his chest just a little too much. He was telling them about the numbers, projections, leveraging assets. His voice boomed, full of a false confidence I knew intimately, a mask he wore only when he felt utterly cornered or utterly victorious. Today, it was the latter. His eyes, when they flicked towards me across the room, held a cold, triumphant glint. A small, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought I was ruined. And standing there, watching him, I felt a strange calm wash over me, the eye of a storm I had been living in for months. My hands, clasped in front of me, didn't tremble. My breath was steady. I just watched him, this man who had shared my bed, built a life with me, promised me forever, now ready to demolish me publicly. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking slightly, betraying the edge beneath the polished performance. This was it. The moment he believed cemented his freedom, his future with her. He was about to raise the glass to his lips, a small, private toast to my demise, I was sure. I saw the movement begin, the subtle shift in his weight, the lift of the arm, the way his eyes locked onto mine one last time, filled with that venomous certainty. And then I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's tense silence like a scalpel. Just a few words. And the glass fell from his hand, hitting the table with a clatter before shattering on the floor. His face, moments before alight with victory, went ashen. His eyes bulged. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stumbled back, grasping the edge of the table. He looked at me, then at his partners, then back at me, his gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal. And then, the color drained completely from his face. He let go of the table, and he crumpled to the floor, a heap of expensive suit and shattered arrogance. The room erupted, but I barely heard it. I just watched him fall. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Our life hadn't always been a battlefield. Not even close. For years, it was a carefully built sanctuary, brick by brick, dream by dream. I met Mark when we were barely out of college, full of fire and ambition, and a naive certainty that together we could conquer anything. He had the drive, the big ideas that seemed impossible to anyone else, and I had the quiet determination, the ability to see the path, to handle the details, to be the anchor while he chased the wind. We were a partnership, unspoken but deeply understood. He started his first company from our tiny apartment, fueled by instant noodles and boundless optimism. I worked my own demanding job, but every spare moment was spent by his side, listening, brainstorming, proofreading endless documents, celebrating tiny victories. I was his first investor, pouring my savings into his vision when everyone else thought he was crazy. I believed in him with a fierceness that surprised even me. He was charismatic, charming, the kind of man who could walk into a room and own it. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world, a talent that served him well in business and, tragically, elsewhere. Early on, it felt genuine. It felt like I was his center, his confidant, the one person he could truly be vulnerable with. We talked for hours about everything, his fears, his hopes, the ruthless world of startups, the people who underestimated him. I saw the ambition, yes, but I also saw a vulnerability beneath it, a need for validation, a fear of failure. I thought my love and support were the steady ground he needed. I thought we were building something together, a future where his success was our shared success, his comfort my comfort. As the company grew, so did our life. The tiny apartment gave way to a comfortable house, then a larger one. The old car was replaced. We started traveling. We built a life that, from the outside, looked like the picture of success and happiness. Mark became a recognized name in his industry. He was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in articles. He worked tirelessly, often late nights, weekends. I understood. This was his passion, his creation. I supported him, managing our home, our social life, providing the stability that allowed him to fly as high as he could. I trusted him implicitly. Our finances were intertwined, as they are in a marriage, built on the assumption of a shared future, a joint legacy. His company's value grew, and with it, our perceived security. He handled the business side, the complex structures, the deals. I focused on making our life together a haven, a place of peace and connection. I wasn't naive. I knew the business world was cutthroat. But I believed our personal world, the world of us, was inviolable. I believed in our vows, our history, the years of shared dreams and sacrifices. I believed in him. That belief was the foundation of my life. It felt solid, unshakable. The future stretched before us, bright and full of promise. There were no warning signs I allowed myself to see, just the steady hum of a life I had built with the man I loved. It wasn't perfect, no life is, but it was ours. It felt safe. It felt real. That feeling of safety, in retrospect, was the most fragile thing of all. It was a beautiful, elaborate sandcastle, waiting for the tide to come in. And the tide, I would soon learn, was already rising, silently, relentlessly, beneath the surface. The man I thought I knew was meticulously, calmly, building barriers, not around us, but between us. He was preparing his escape route, and I was blissfully unaware, busy fortifying a home that would soon become a cage. I was living in a beautiful lie, handcrafted by the person I trusted most. The first crack was small, almost imperceptible. A late night that stretched into dawn, a phone call he took outside, his voice low and guarded. Then came the changes, the sudden interest in his appearance, the expensive new cologne, the excuses for missing dinner, for being distant. The excuses became more elaborate, the lies more transparent, to an eye finally forced to look. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping frost that settled over our home, chilling the warmth that had once filled it. The air grew heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of secrets he carried like a shield. I tried to talk to him, to ask what was wrong. He became defensive, agitated. Just stress, he'd say. The business is demanding right now, and for a while, I wanted to believe him. The truth, when it finally hit, wasn't delivered with a bang, but with a whisper carried on the digital wind. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home, sitting at my desk, a pile of invoices beside me. My laptop pinged. An email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was cryptic, something about the truth. My first instinct was to delete it, spam. But something made me pause. Curiosity, dread, a sick premonition I hadn't allowed myself to name. I clicked it open. It contained screenshots. Screenshots of messages. Between Mark and someone named Chloe, the messages were explicit, undeniable, a brutal catalog of their affair, stolen moments, whispered plans, declarations of love, and, most damningly, discussions about me. About how to handle me, how to minimize my claims, how he was setting things up so I wouldn't be able to touch his assets, his company. Reading his words, seeing his plans laid bare, was like being struck by lightning. The air left my lungs. My vision blurred. My hands started to shake violently, rattling the keyboard. It wasn't just the betrayal of our marriage, the intimacy shared with another woman. It was the cold, calculated cruelty, the strategic dismantling of our shared life, his plan to leave me with nothing. He wasn't just cheating, he was plotting my financial ruin. The screenshots revealed his strategy, structuring company finances in a way that made his ownership stake appear less valuable in a divorce, shifting assets, creating paper trails designed to obscure his true wealth, even discussing how he could argue that I had contributed nothing of value to his company. His words in those messages were chillingly devoid of empathy, full of arrogance and a smug certainty that he was outsmarting me, that I was too naive, too trusting, too focused on the emotional side of things to understand the financial game he was playing. She won't see it coming, he'd written to her. She's too soft. I've got this locked down. She can't touch me now, that phrase. She can't touch me now, it echoed in my head, a cruel, mocking refrain. It was the confirmation of his betrayal, not just of my heart, but of my entire future, the years of support and sacrifice dismissed as nothing. The email contained more than messages. It had attachments, blurred photos of Mark and Chloe together, looking happy, relaxed, building their future on the ruins of mine. It felt like a physical blow. I stumbled from my desk, clutching my stomach. The images seared into my mind. I made it to the bathroom and collapsed on the cold tile floor, retching until there was nothing left. I stayed there for a long time, the world outside the bathroom door feeling alien and hostile. The life I knew was over. The man I loved was a stranger, a predator.
And he thought he had won.
The initial shock gave way to a raw, searing pain that felt like being flayed alive. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The house, once our haven, became a tomb. Every object, every photograph, was a reminder of the lie I had been living. Mark came home, oblivious or pretending to be. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't speak. His presence felt like a violation. For days, I existed in a fog of despair. I went through the motions, mechanical and hollow. He noticed I was distant, quiet, but attributed it to stress, my job, anything but the truth he believed was safely hidden. He grew impatient with my silence, annoyed by my lack of engagement. He preferred me happy, supportive, blind. My grief was inconvenient. I tried briefly to confront him. One evening, I managed to choke out a question, something vague about our future, about feeling disconnected. He shut down immediately, defensive, irritable.
Not now, he snapped.
I've had a rough day. Can't you just be supportive? His words were a cruel echo of the messages I'd read, the ones where he discussed how to handle my emotional reactions. It solidified the truth. He wasn't just making a mistake. He was executing a plan. A confrontation felt useless, even dangerous. He was armed with lies and legal strategy. I was armed with a broken heart and shaking hands. I started researching late at night when he was presumably with her or working late. I looked up divorce lawyers, financial advisors. The legal jargon was overwhelming, confusing. Everything pointed to the complexity of dividing assets tied up in a private company, especially when one spouse had been actively trying to shield them. The messages indicated he had been getting advice, setting things up for months, maybe even years. I felt increasingly helpless. The financial structures he had created were designed to be opaque, to minimize his visible wealth, to make it seem like the company's value was tied solely to his genius, not built on years of shared sacrifice and support. I spoke to one lawyer, a highly recommended specialist in complex divorces. She listened patiently as I explained the situation, the company, the messages. Her expression grew increasingly grim. Based on what you're describing, she said, her voice gentle but firm, this is going to be incredibly difficult. He's been very careful. Proving your contribution, tracing assets, it will be a long, expensive fight. And given the way he's structured things, his claims that you contributed nothing to the business itself might hold weight, even if you contributed to the life that allowed him to build it. He's made himself appear indispensable to the company's value, minimizing his personal financial stake and making it difficult to attach value that isn't solely linked to him. Her words were a cold shower. Even with the evidence of his intent, the legal battle would be uphill, draining, and with no guarantee of a just outcome. He wasn't just trying to leave me. He was trying to erase me from the narrative of his success, to legally and financially detach himself in the cleanest, most ruthless way possible. The days bled into weeks. Mark became bolder. He spent more nights away, stopped making excuses. He seemed lighter, happier, fueled by his new life and his perceived victory over me. He moved through the house like a ghost, a cruel reminder of what was lost. The financial stress began to mount. He started controlling access to funds, citing business needs. Bills became a point of contention. He was slowly, systematically, suffocating my access to the life we had built. The "she can't touch me now" plan wasn't just for the divorce. It was being implemented in real time, making my present miserable and my future seem impossible. I felt trapped, my options shrinking, my hope dwindling. I was sinking, and he was watching from the shore, secure in his belief that he had built a fortress I could not breach. The weight of it all felt crushing. Every breath was a struggle. The despair was a physical ache. I was losing everything: my marriage, my financial security, my sense of self. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, watching it dissolve before my eyes. One particularly bleak morning, I woke up and the despair felt heavier than usual. I couldn't get out of bed. The thought of facing another day in that house, with that man, felt unbearable. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the phrase, "She can't touch me now," echoing in the silence. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity. It was about agency. He believed he had rendered me powerless, invisible. And in that moment of absolute rock bottom, something inside me shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it hardened. It became a shell, a shield. Despair turned into a cold, quiet fury. He thought I was soft. He thought I was naive. He thought I was too emotional to fight back. He had fundamentally misunderstood me, just as he had fundamentally betrayed me. The woman he had planned to discard wasn't the woman I was becoming. Lying in that bed, amidst the wreckage of my life, I started to think differently. Not about salvaging the marriage, not about getting a fair settlement through endless, painful legal battles. I started to think about power, about leverage. He had used the system, his knowledge of finance, his ruthlessness to try and gain absolute control. Could I use something similar? My mind, dulled by grief for so long, began to sharpen. I thought about his company, the source of his arrogance, the very thing he was using as his shield. What made it vulnerable? What was its weakness? I remembered snippets of conversations, things he'd mentioned over the years, details I'd filed away without realizing their significance. Complex funding rounds, venture capital, debt financing. His company, like many high-growth tech firms, wasn't built on profit alone. It was built on investment and debt. He was always talking about raising funds, securing loans, expanding rapidly, leveraging everything. That's how he'd grown so fast. But leverage is a double-edged sword. It magnifies gains, but it also magnifies risk. And risk, for someone who felt untouchable, was the last thing he expected me to understand, let alone exploit. I needed information. Real, hard data. Not just whispers and screenshots. I needed to understand the financial architecture of his company, the precise nature of its vulnerabilities. Who held its debt? Who were its key investors? What were the terms of their agreements? This wasn't something I could get through standard legal discovery, not without triggering alarms and facing months of obstruction. I needed a different approach. And I needed help. There was only one person I knew who understood this world intimately, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate finance and emerged not just successful, but respected and powerful. My father. Our relationship had always been close, built on mutual respect and a shared quiet strength. He wasn't the type for grand gestures or emotional outbursts, but his support was a constant, unwavering presence. He had built his own empire, starting from scratch, understanding the levers of power, the intricate dance of debt and equity, the cold logic that underpinned the business world. He had taught me indirectly some of these lessons over the years, lessons I hadn't realized I was absorbing until now. He knew Mark, had even advised him a few times in the early days, seen his potential, but also, I suspected now, perhaps seen the ambition that bordered on arrogance. Calling him felt like crossing a threshold. It meant admitting the full scale of the disaster, the depth of the betrayal, the precariousness of my situation. But the cold resolve had settled in. This wasn't about shame anymore. It was about survival, and more than that, it was about turning the tables. He thought I couldn't touch him? I was about to find out exactly where he was most vulnerable. I called my father. His voice, calm and steady as always, was a balm. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told him everything. The affair, the messages, the "she can't touch me now" plan, the legal challenges, the feeling of being trapped. I laid it all out, raw and unfiltered. There was a long silence on the other end when I finished. I waited, my heart pounding.
Finally, he spoke.
He underestimated you, he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. It was a simple, factual statement. And he underestimated the bond you and I share. He didn't express anger or shock in the way others might. His response was measured, analytical. You said he's leveraged? Heavily reliant on debt financing. Yes, I confirmed. He's always expanding, borrowing heavily against future projections. He calls it aggressive growth strategy, my father hummed thoughtfully. Aggressive growth built on shaky foundations is just recklessness, he observed dryly. Especially if you're not careful who holds the leash. He asked me about the structure of the debt, the names of the key lenders if I knew them. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew the types of institutions he dealt with. My father listened, asked clarifying questions, his mind already working. Here's what we're going to do, he said, outlining a plan that was audacious, complex, and breathtakingly precise. It wasn't about suing Mark. It was about applying pressure to the one thing he truly valued, the source of his power and identity, his company. My father explained the world of distressed debt, the opportunities that arise when companies are over-leveraged and reliant on impatient creditors. He talked about buying up debt, becoming a significant creditor, potentially calling in loans or forcing a restructuring. It was a language I barely understood, but the core concept was crystal clear. Gain control of the strings that held his company afloat. The plan was risky, expensive, and would require absolute secrecy. If Mark got wind of it, he could take steps to mitigate the damage, refinance, or shore up his position. But my father had the resources, the network, and the expertise to move quietly and quickly. He wouldn't be doing this for me out of simple charity. He saw it as a calculated move, a strategic play in the corporate world he inhabited, with the added satisfaction of protecting his daughter and teaching a ruthless young man a very hard lesson about true power and loyalty. My father was the silent partner I never knew I needed, the ultimate check and balance against Mark's unchecked arrogance. He agreed to help, not just with advice, but with action. The cold fury within me solidified into a steely resolve. Mark thought I couldn't touch him? He had just given me the blueprint to dismantle his entire world. The game had changed. I was no longer a victim. I was a player, and I had the most powerful ally imaginable. The fight was on, and it wouldn't be fought in a divorce court, but in the shadows of high finance, on ground Mark thought was exclusively his. My father's calm certainty was the first ray of light I had seen in months. I felt a surge of energy, a sense of purpose that had been missing for too long. I was ready. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in covert operations and corporate maneuvering. My father worked through layers of intermediaries, shell companies, and anonymous transactions. He targeted key lenders, particularly those holding the most significant or shortest-term debt. It wasn't about acquiring the company outright, not initially. It was about becoming a major creditor, someone with leverage, someone who could suddenly make demands, change terms, or, in a worst-case scenario for Mark, call in the loans. I provided my father with any information I could glean from Mark's casual conversations, discarded documents, anything that shed light on the company's financial state or his relationships with lenders. I had to be careful, utterly undetectable. Living under the same roof as the man I was planning to dismantle was surreal. I maintained a facade of quiet despondency, letting him believe I was defeated, consumed by grief and helplessness. He grew comfortable in his perceived victory, bolder in his movements, spending more time away, talking more openly on the phone, though always guarded about his plans with Chloe and his company. He was so convinced I was out of the picture, so focused on his future, that he missed the subtle shifts, the occasional question I asked that seemed innocuous, but was designed to confirm a detail my father needed. Mark's arrogance was my greatest asset. He was so certain he had outmaneuvered me that he dropped his guard. I overheard him on the phone one night, talking to Chloe.
His voice was smug.
Just wrapping up the final structure. It's foolproof. She gets peanuts. The company valuation is solid, but structured in a way that her claim on it is minimal. The lawyers are happy. My investors are happy. Chloe, darling, we are happy. She can't touch me now. Not a damn thing she can do, he laughed, a short, sharp sound that sent shivers down my spine. He repeated the phrase, savoring it. Can't touch me now, he truly believed it. He saw me as a problem solved, a past life neatly compartmentalized and neutralized. He was so focused on the future he was building with Chloe that he didn't look back to see the shadow lengthening behind him. Meanwhile, my father's team was executing the plan. Buying up debt isn't simple. It requires willing sellers, often other financial institutions looking to offload risk. My father leveraged his reputation, his network, and his capital. He explained to me that the goal wasn't necessarily to call in all the debt and bankrupt him, though that was an option. The real power was in the control. By becoming a significant creditor, my father could influence the company's decisions, demand financial transparency that would expose Mark's manipulations, or, most effectively, create an environment of instability that would spook other investors and lenders, potentially triggering clauses in their own agreements that could force Mark's hand. The specific debt my father was targeting was a mix of corporate loans and personal guarantees Mark had signed, tying his personal fortune, what he hadn't already tried to hide, directly to the company's performance and its ability to service its debt. Mark, in his haste to expand and his certainty of success, had taken on significant personal risk, a fact he seemed to have conveniently forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant because he believed nothing could go wrong. The plan was coming together, piece by piece, in secret. The tension in the house was palpable, though Mark seemed oblivious, attributing it to my continued mood. He was like a man dancing on a tightrope, unaware that someone was quietly sawing through the ropes. The more confident he became, the more careless he got. He'd leave his laptop open, financial documents scattered on his desk. I became an expert at absorbing details with a glance, remembering names, numbers, dates, feeding them to my father. It was a strange, silent war being waged within the walls of our home. He plotted his liberation, and I plotted his downfall. And he never saw it coming. The phrase, "she can't touch me now," became my fuel, my mantra. Every time it echoed in my mind, it reinforced my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting against the fundamental injustice of his arrogance, his cruelty, his absolute certainty of his own impunity. He thought he was playing chess, but he didn't realize I had learned the game on a different board entirely, one where the rules weren't just about position and pieces, but about leverage and control. The crisis point for Mark arrived subtly at first. His access to credit tightened. Lenders who were usually eager to work with him became hesitant, asking more questions, demanding more collateral. He attributed it to a temporary market shift, nothing significant. He was still riding high on the wave of his perceived success and the excitement of his future with Chloe. He started spending even more lavishly, perhaps as a way to prove his success, his untouchability. He bought Chloe expensive gifts, took her on lavish trips, all while our joint accounts dwindled. This reckless spending, fueled by his arrogance, only made his financial position more precarious, further leveraging him personally and increasing the strain on his ability to service his debt. It was as if he was accelerating his own demise, completely unaware. Then came the calls. More frequent, more insistent calls from banks and investment firms. His irritation grew. He started having hushed, tense conversations behind closed doors. The confident swagger began to show cracks. His dismissiveness towards me shifted to outright hostility. My quiet presence became an accusation. He needed someone to blame for the undefined pressure he was feeling, and I was the easiest target. He started picking fights over trivial things, his temper short, his patience gone. The house, already a cold place, became actively hostile. He accused me of being lazy, ungrateful, a drain on his resources. He didn't know how accurate those last accusations were becoming, not in the way he meant. The true deepening crisis began when one of his key lenders unexpectedly called a significant portion of his debt. It wasn't due yet, not for months, maybe a year. But the terms of the loan, like many leveraged agreements, likely included clauses that allowed the lender to demand early repayment under certain circumstances, perhaps a perceived increase in risk, a change in market conditions, or, say, a change in the creditor's ownership that triggered a more conservative approach. My father, having acquired that debt, had the power to exercise that option. The call blindsided Mark. I saw the color drain from his face as he took the call in his office. His voice rose from confident negotiation to stunned disbelief, then panic. He slammed the phone down, his hands shaking violently. He started pacing, muttering to himself. He made a flurry of other calls, his voice increasingly desperate. He was trying to understand why. Why now? Who was doing this? He was used to being in control, dictating terms. This was entirely outside his experience. He became obsessed with finding out who was behind it. He suspected competitors, disgruntled former employees, anyone but the quiet, broken wife he thought he had left in the dust. He spent hours digging, searching, his paranoia growing. He was so focused on the corporate landscape he knew, the usual players and power brokers, that the idea that the threat could come from within his own home was unthinkable. His investigation methods were crude, limited to the world he understood. He didn't know about the layers of anonymity my father had used, the quiet transactions happening far below his radar. The pressure mounted. Other lenders, seeing the first one pull back, started getting nervous. This is the domino effect my father had anticipated. Debt is interconnected. Instability with one creditor spooks the others. Mark was suddenly facing demands he couldn't meet immediately. He tried to secure new financing, but the market sensed weakness. His usual charm and projections weren't enough. The whispers started, the kind that can sink a company faster than any market downturn. Questions were being asked about his financial health, his stability, his personal guarantees. The very leverage he had used to build his empire was now crushing him. He stopped going to the office as much, spending days at home, hunched over his laptop, his face pale and drawn. He barely spoke to me, lost in his own spiraling panic. The arrogance was replaced by a raw, ugly fear. He was cornered, and he didn't know who was holding the knife. He snapped at Chloe on the phone, his voice harsh and impatient. The dream they were building together was looking increasingly shaky. His untouchable world was crumbling, and he didn't understand how or why. He was looking for a complex conspiracy, a corporate raid, a rival's attack. He never once considered the woman sleeping in the next room, the woman he had so confidently declared couldn't touch him. The crisis was deepening, not just for his company, but for him, personally. His identity was so tied to his success, his control, his ability to outsmart everyone. Now, he was failing, losing control, and being outsmarted by an invisible foe. He was a cornered animal, dangerous in his desperation, but also blind to the true nature of the threat. He was so close to collapse, and the person who would deliver the final push was standing right beside him. The invitation arrived 2 days before the planned confrontation. A formal request for a meeting from one of the investment firms that now held a significant portion of his company's debt. It was innocuous enough on the surface, a standard meeting to discuss the company's financial outlook and future strategy, but the timing, the specific firm, the carefully worded agenda, I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was it. This was the moment my father had orchestrated, the stage set for the final act. The investment firm he had acquired held the key leverage, and this meeting would be the place where that leverage was revealed, where Mark would come face to face with the consequences of his actions, not through a legal notice from a divorce lawyer, but through the cold, hard reality of corporate finance. Mark was apprehensive about the meeting, but also saw it as an opportunity to charm, to persuade, to regain control. He spent hours preparing, rehearsing his pitches, compiling optimistic data. He was still in denial about the true depth of his predicament, clinging to the belief that this was just a temporary setback he could talk his way out of. He didn't know who he was really meeting. He didn't know the firm represented my father's interests. He certainly didn't know I would be there. My father had insisted I attend. "You need to be there," he'd said, his voice firm. "This is your victory. You need to see it. You need him to see you." He understood that the emotional resolution for me wasn't just in the outcome, but in the witnessing, in reclaiming my power in the face of his attempt to render me powerless. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. The air felt electric with anticipation. I thought about the journey, the loving wife, the shattered victim, the quiet strategist. I thought about Mark's smug face in the screenshots, his cruel words. She can't touch me now. Those words had been a curse, but they had also been a catalyst. They had woken me up, transformed my pain into purpose. I wasn't the same woman who had crumpled on the bathroom floor. The betrayal had burned away the naivete, leaving behind something harder, colder, but also infinitely stronger. Getting ready for the meeting felt like preparing for battle. I chose my clothes carefully, a simple, elegant dress, nothing flashy, nothing weak. I styled my hair, applied makeup. I wanted to look composed, formidable, utterly unlike the weeping wreck he imagined me to be. As I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the heartbroken wife. I saw a woman who had survived a storm and was now ready to face the wreckage she had helped create. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet determination, a sense of purpose. This wasn't revenge, not entirely. It was justice. It was the restoration of balance. He had sought to erase me, to dismiss my worth, to steal my future. Now, I would watch his future crumble under the weight of his own hubris, orchestrated by the very person he had believed powerless. I felt a strange mix of emotions, a cold satisfaction, yes, but also a deep, lingering sadness for the life we had lost, for the man I had loved who had turned into this. But the sadness was tempered by the knowledge that he had made his choice, and I had made mine. My turning point wasn't just a decision to fight. It was a decision to win, on my own terms, using the very tools he thought were exclusively his. I was ready to walk into that boardroom, not as his wife, not as his victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. The boardroom was the same one where he had so confidently predicted my ruin. The air was just as thick, the smell of stale coffee just as potent. Mark was already there, sitting on one side of the long table with his legal counsel and his CFO. He looked tense, his usual bravado replaced by a thin veneer of forced confidence. When I walked in with my father and his team, Mark's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. He hadn't expected me. He certainly hadn't expected me to arrive with my father and with a team that clearly represented serious financial power. His face paled slightly, but he quickly recovered, offering a strained smile. My father introduced himself and his colleagues. He didn't mention his relationship to me immediately. He simply stated that their firm now represented a significant portion of the company's outstanding debt and wished to discuss its current financial health and future prospects. Mark started his presentation, launching into his rehearsed pitch, full of projections and buzzwords. He was trying to be the charismatic leader, the visionary who could overcome any obstacle. But his voice lacked its usual conviction, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He avoided looking at me. After he finished, my father's lead negotiator, a sharp, calm woman named Sarah, began to speak. She went through the company's financials with surgical precision, pointing out vulnerabilities, questioning assumptions, highlighting the heavy reliance on debt financing. Mark grew increasingly agitated, interrupting, trying to deflect. He was losing control of the narrative. Then, Sarah shifted gears. She brought up the terms of the debt agreements my father's firm now held. She spoke about clauses related to financial stability, key person risk, and the right of creditors to demand accelerated repayment under certain conditions. Mark shifted uneasily in his chair. He knew these clauses existed, but he'd always assumed they were theoretical, never applied to a company like his, a company on the brink of massive growth. And then Sarah dropped the hammer. Calmly, without fanfare, she stated that given the current financial indicators and perceived increase in risk, the firm was exercising its right to call in a significant portion of the debt immediately. Not in a few months. Not next quarter.
Now.
She named a sum, a staggering amount that Mark's company could not possibly produce on short notice without liquidating core assets at fire sale prices or securing equally massive emergency financing, which, in the current climate my father had helped create, was impossible. The room fell silent. Mark stared at Sarah, then at my father, then his eyes finally landed on me. He was trying to process what was happening, trying to understand the source of this sudden, catastrophic pressure. He saw my father, saw his team, saw me sitting there, calm and steady. And in that moment, he connected the dots. He saw that the threat wasn't some faceless corporate rival or a market downer. It was coming from the family he had tried to discard, the woman he had so arrogantly claimed couldn't touch him. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled sound came out. His face, moments before flushed with a desperate attempt at confidence, went completely white. His eyes, fixed on mine, filled with a dawning horror, a realization of the absolute checkmate he was in. The carefully constructed fortress of his arrogance crumbled before my eyes. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, the ghost of the woman he thought he had killed. He tried to stand, to say something, anything, to regain control, to bluff his way out. But his legs wouldn't hold him. He grasped the edge of the polished table, his knuckles turning white. His breath hitched. He looked at me again, his gaze no longer arrogant, but filled with pure, unadulterated shock and terror. He saw not the wife he had betrayed, but the architect of his downfall. And then, just as it had happened in my imagination so many times, his grip on the table failed, and he collapsed. The room erupted. His CFO and lawyer rushed to his side. Someone yelled for a medic. But I just sat there, watching him. The arrogant man who had bragged about his impunity was a heap on the floor, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. "She can't touch me now," he had said. But I had. I had touched him at the very core of his being, the source of his power, the foundation of his identity. And I had watched him break. There was no triumph in his collapse itself, only the cold, quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice, in its own complex, unexpected way, had been served. He had built his power on debt, betrayal, and the underestimation of others. And it was debt, orchestrated by the person he underestimated most, that had brought him down. The silence in the room after the initial shock subsided was deafening. It was the sound of a life shattering, a future dissolving into dust. The aftermath was a blur of activity and stunned silence. Paramedics arrived, attended to Mark. He hadn't had a heart attack, they said, but a severe panic attack, perhaps exacerbated by stress. He was conscious but disoriented, utterly defeated. My father and his team were calm, professional. Sarah reiterated the firm's position regarding the debt, the terms unwavering despite the dramatic turn of events. Mark's CFO and lawyer, pale and shaken, understood the gravity of the situation. With the debt called, and no immediate way to repay it, the company was facing imminent collapse or a forced restructuring that would strip Mark of his control and likely most of his ownership. I stayed in the boardroom, watching from a distance as they helped Mark to his feet. He looked diminished, frail, utterly broken. He avoided my eyes. There was nothing left to say between us. The betrayal, the struggle, the confrontation, it had all culminated in this moment, and there was no coming back. The man I had loved, the man who had hurt me so deeply, was gone, replaced by this hollow shell. The process that followed was swift and brutal, at least for him. With the major debt called, other creditors tightened their belts. Investors panicked. The carefully constructed empire built on leverage and ambition crumbled rapidly. There was no saving it. Mark lost control of the company he had poured his life into. It went through a forced restructuring, ownership diluted, his role eliminated. The assets he had tried to hide were exposed during the financial scrutiny. The peanuts he planned to leave me with turned into a significant settlement as his true financial picture was revealed during the fallout, ironically expedited by the very crisis he had created. Chloe, unsurprisingly, disappeared. The future they had planned, built on my ruin, evaporated the moment his financial security did. Their relationship, it turned out, was as leveraged as his company, unsustainable without the promise of wealth and power. For me, the emotional fallout was complex. There was relief, a profound sense of having survived and prevailed against impossible odds. There was vindication, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I hadn't been powerless, hadn't been defeated. But there was also grief. Grief for the years lost, for the trust broken beyond repair, for the person I thought Mark was. Watching him fall hadn't been a moment of pure joy, but a realization of the destructive path he had chosen, a path that ultimately consumed him. He was so focused on winning that he lost sight of everything else, including himself. My father's involvement was a turning point in our relationship, too. It solidified our bond, a silent understanding of strength and strategy. He didn't want credit. Seeing me stand on my own, having orchestrated my own resolution with his expert assistance, was enough for him. He simply said, "You found your leverage." He forgot. He wasn't the only one who understood the rules. Life after Mark is quieter. The grand house felt too big, too full of ghosts. I sold it. I didn't need his money to start over, but the settlement allowed me the freedom to choose my path without financial constraint. I explored interests I had put aside, reconnected with friends, slowly, piece by piece, rebuilt a life that was truly mine. The scar tissue from the betrayal remains, a reminder of the pain, but also of the resilience. I learned that strength isn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet, strategic, and waits patiently for the right moment. I learned that trust, once broken, is impossible to fully repair. And I learned that the person who thinks they are untouchable is often the most vulnerable because they stop looking for the quiet hand that might be reaching out to pull the rug out from under them. Mark thought he could structure his life, his finances, his relationships to be impenetrable. But he forgot about the unseen forces, the human connections, the quiet strength of the person he dismissed. He thought he could simply write me out of his story. But in the end, I wrote the final chapter of his. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.